The gate is set into a thick wall of grey stone, the same stone that runs all around the monastery grounds, and above it a small carving of a saint, with a worn face and folded hands, looks out over the valley. You lift the iron knocker, a ring held in the mouth of a lion, and let it fall once against the plate, the sound a dull clang that seems to be swallowed almost immediately by the quiet. The door opens a crack, then wider, and a man in a dusty brown robe stands before you, his hair thin and white, his eyes pale blue and perfectly calm. He does not speak at first, just looks at you with a kind of slow recognition, as if he has been expecting you for a long time, and you have arrived exactly when you were supposed to. Then he steps aside and gestures for you to enter, his hand moving in a small, unhurried arc. You step over the threshold and find yourself in a covered passage that leads to the main courtyard, a space open to the sky with a square of green grass in the center and a stone well at its heart. The gatekeeper walks ahead of you without looking back, his sandals making a soft brushing sound on the flagstones, and you follow him through the cloister walkway, where the arches repeat one after another in an unbroken sequence. The stones underfoot are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, polished to a dull sheen, and you notice the slight hollow in the center of each flag where countless sandals have pressed the rock away, grain by grain over time. The rhythm of the place reaches you gradually, the way the light falls in long, unbroken bands across the paving stones, the way the few monks you see move without any hurry, their hands tucked into the wide sleeves of their habits and their gazes directed somewhere just ahead of their feet. No one looks at you directly, and no one speaks, and you realize that this is not unfriendliness but simply the deep habit of silence that governs the community. The gatekeeper leads you around the corner of the cloister and into a small room where a different monk sits behind a plain wooden table, a ledger open before him, and a quill resting in a clay pot full of sand. This man, the guest master, has a round face and a fringe of grey hair around his tonsure, and he looks up at you with a mild expression that holds no curiosity, only a patient willingness to receive whatever you might say. He speaks in a low murmur, his voice as steady as a slow drip of water from a leaky roof, explaining the rules of silence and the hours of prayer, telling you that the great bell in the tower will ring 7 times each day and once in the night, marking the offices of vigils, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. You will not be expected to attend all of them, he says, because your work in the library will be considered a form of prayer in itself, but you are welcome in the choir stall whenever you wish to sit and listen to the chanting. He asks if you understand, and you nod, and he writes something in his ledger with a scratch of the quill, a single line that records your arrival in ink that will fade slowly over the decades until it becomes just a pale ghost on the page. From the guest master's room, the gatekeeper leads you up a narrow flight of stone stairs that twist in a tight spiral, the wall cool and slightly damp under your hand as you climb. At the top, a short corridor with 3 doors, and he stops at the second one, pushing it open to reveal a small cell that will be yours. The room is simple, a narrow bed with a straw mattress and a grey wool blanket folded at its foot, a wooden table set under a window that looks out onto the vegetable garden, a stool, a small chest for your belongings, and a peg on the wall for your cloak. The window is small and set deep into the wall, its wooden frame unpainted, and through it you can see the ordered rows of the garden, cabbages and beans and leeks standing in quiet lines, their leaves a muted green in the grey light. A cat, lean and grey, walks slowly along the edge of a raised bed, pausing to sniff at a tuft of chamomile before moving on. The gatekeeper stands in the doorway for a moment, his hands resting one on top of the other, and then he gives a small nod and turns away, his footsteps fading back down the stone stairs. You set your bundle on the bed and untie the leather cord that holds it closed, lifting out a spare tunic of undyed wool, a pair of wooden clogs with leather straps, a small knife with a curved blade for sharpening quills, a comb carved from boxwood, and a little drawstring bag containing a handful of dried figs and a piece of hard cheese wrapped in a cloth. You place each item in its place, the tunic folded in the chest, the clogs lined up under the bed, the knife and comb laid side by side on the wooden table where they will live from now on. The table is rough under your palms, the grain of the wood raised in tiny ridges from years of being scrubbed with wet cloths, and you stand there for a moment, pressing your hands flat against it, feeling the surface that will support your work, your meals, your small acts of daily life. The light from the window changes slowly, the grey deepening a shade as the afternoon moves toward evening, and you hear the distant sound of a bell, a low and sonorous note that vibrates through the stones of the wall. This is the bell for Vespers, the evening prayer, and you know from the guest master's instructions that supper will follow in the refectory. You wash your hands in the small basin of water that sits on a ledge by the door, the water cold and clean, and you dry them on the rough linen towel that hangs beside it. Then you find your way back down the spiral stairs and along the cloister walk to the refectory, a long room with a high timber roof and rows of tables set parallel to the walls, where the brothers are already taking their places on wooden benches. You sit at the end of one table, a space that seems to have been left for you, and a kitchen brother places before you a bowl of lentil stew, a thick slice of dark bread, and a clay cup filled with water from the well. The stew is simple, lentils cooked with onions and a little thyme, and you eat it slowly, spooning it up while the steam rises and fades in front of your face. At a lectern in the middle of the room, one of the brothers stands reading aloud from a book of saints' lives, his voice a continuous hum that runs just under the high ceiling, the words not meant to be followed carefully, but simply to provide a gentle current of sound. You catch fragments, a desert father, a well, a loaf of bread, a lion, and they drift past you like leaves on the surface of a slow stream. The brothers eat with their eyes down, their spoons moving in a quiet rhythm, and the only other sounds are the occasional scrape of a bowl and the soft footfalls of the kitchen brother as he moves along the tables refilling water cups. When the meal is finished, a grace is said, a single long sentence in Latin that rises and falls like a small wave, and the brothers file out into the cloister for the brief period of recreation before compline. You do not follow them. Instead, you stand in the doorway of the refectory, looking across the courtyard where the dusk is filling the open square with a blue-grey haze. The well in the center casts a faint shadow, longer now than it was when you arrived, and you watch a single bat flicker across the darkening sky in a quick, jagged path before it disappears over the roof of the church. The abbot finds you there, coming up beside you without a sound, a tall man with a face like weathered stone and dark eyes that are set deep under a shelf of brow. He wears the same brown robe as the others, but there is a quiet authority in his stillness, a sense that he has been standing in doorways like this for many years, observing the fall of evening without any need to comment on it. He speaks your name once, as if testing its weight, and then he asks if you will walk with him in the garden for a moment, before the last office of the day. You follow him through a small gate in the cloister wall and into the kitchen garden, where the rows of vegetables are becoming indistinct in the fading light, their shapes merging into a single dark mass. The abbot walks slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, and he tells you about the library, about how it has been without a dedicated keeper since the old librarian died the previous winter. The brother who looked after it in the meantime did his best, but he was needed in the infirmary and could only spare a few hours each week, and so there is much dust, many books that need their bindings checked, and a general disarray that will require a careful hand. Some of the books, he says, are very old, their spines as brittle as dry bread, and they will crack if handled without patience. He does not mention the hidden books, not yet, but as he speaks, you sense something held back in his slow blinking eyes, a weight that he is not ready to set down. You walk together to the end of the garden, where a bench made of a single slab of stone rests against the wall, and the abbot sits down, gesturing for you to join him. The air is grown cooler, and a thin mist is beginning to rise from the grass, visible only as a faint whiteness close to the ground. The abbot is silent for a long while, and you sit in that silence, hearing the first notes of the little owl that lives in the bell tower, a soft repeated call that comes every few seconds like a small bell of its own. Then the abbot speaks again, his voice lower than before, telling you that the library is one of the oldest parts of the monastery, built over the chapter house 300 years ago by a brother who had travelled to Monte Cassino and wanted to bring something of that great library home. The floor is oak, the roof is chestnut, and the windows were glazed by a travelling craftsman from Bohemia whose name has been forgotten, but whose work still holds, flawed and wavy and beautiful in the late afternoon light. You will find, the abbot says, that the room has its own way of keeping time, slower than the bell tower, slower even than the garden, and your task will be to match that rhythm rather than impose your own. The bell for Compline rings then, a single deep note that rolls across the monastery grounds and fades into the mist. The abbot rises, his joints making a small sound of effort, and he places a hand briefly on your shoulder before walking back toward the church. You do not follow him immediately, staying a moment longer on the stone bench, feeling the cool of the rock through your robe and watching the mist thicken until the rows of cabbages are no longer visible at all. The owl calls again, and you think about the library waiting above the chapter house, dark now and silent, the books standing in their rows on the wooden lecterns, the dust settling grain by grain in the still air. Later, after the chanting of Compline has ended and the brothers have dispersed to their cells for the great silence of the night, you lie on your narrow bed with the wool blanket pulled up to your chin and the window open a crack to the night air. The room is dark, but not entirely. A faint glow from the moon just past full, filtering through the thin clouds and casting a soft grey light on the wall above your head. You can hear the monastery breathing around you. The tiny creak of a timber somewhere in the roof, the distant murmur of a brother turning in his sleep, the wind moving through the cloister arches with a sound like a long, slow exhale. The day settles into your bones like sediment in a still pond, all the small moments layering one on top of another, the cart, the gate, the courtyard stones, the guest master's soft voice, the bowl of stew, the abbot's hand on your shoulder, and finally the image of the library waiting for you, dark and patient, a space you have not yet seen, but already feel drawing you toward it, with a quiet, steady pull. You close your eyes and let your breathing find the rhythm of the owl's call, slow and even, and then you are asleep before you can notice the transition, the first night of many that you will spend within these walls, wrapped in a silence so deep it feels like the stones themselves are dreaming. The morning after your arrival, you wake to the deep, resonant note of the bell calling the community to lauds, a sound that seems to rise up from the stones themselves, vibrating through the walls and into your bones. You lie still for a moment, letting the last traces of sleep dissolve, and then you rise in the grey half-light, wash your face in the cold water of the basin, and dress in your wool tunic and leather belt. The stone floor is cool under your bare feet before you slip on your clogs, and you move quietly down the spiral stairs into the cloister walk, where a few brothers are already drifting toward the church, their shapes dark and unhurried in the dimness. You do not follow them, because the abbot told you last night that your first task today is to find the library and begin your work, and so you turn instead toward the chapter house, the location he described, at the eastern end of the cloister square. The chapter house is a low, solid building with a heavy oak door that stands slightly ajar, and inside it is a round room with stone benches around the walls where the community gathers each morning to hear a chapter of the rule read aloud. At the far side, tucked into an alcove that you might have missed if you were not looking for it, a narrow doorway opens onto a spiral stone staircase that climbs upward into shadow. You place your hand on the curved wall to steady yourself and begin to climb. The steps worn into a gentle dip in the center from centuries of use, and the air grows slightly cooler as you ascend, carrying a faint scent of old vellum, beeswax, and a trace of wood smoke from somewhere above. The staircase turns twice around its central pillar, and then you emerge into the library, a long room that stretches the full length of the chapter house below, its high ceiling supported by chestnut beams that have darkened over time to the color of strong tea. You stop at the top of the stairs and simply stand there, letting the room make its impression on you. Tall windows with thick, greenish glass set into stone embrasures run along the eastern wall, and the light that comes through them is soft and diffused, falling in pale green-gold rectangles on the wide oak floorboards. The windows look out over the cloister garth, and through the wavy glass you can make out the blurred shapes of the garden, the well, and the arched walkway beyond. Along the opposite wall between the windows, rows of wooden lecterns stand at precise intervals, each one angled slightly to catch the best light from its neighbouring window, and on each lectern a book rests, some open to a particular page, others closed with metal clasps, and lying on their sides like sleeping animals. At the far end of the room, a small brazier made of black iron glows, with a bed of coals, a thin plume of smoke rising into a flue that disappears into the ceiling. The air is warm enough to be comfortable, but not hot, and the only sound is the soft crackle of the coals and the faint, distant murmur of the monks chanting in the church below. You walk slowly into the room, your footsteps making a low, hollow sound on the boards, and you notice that certain floor planks creak in particular places, a language of the building that you will come to know in time. The library is not large in the way of a great cathedral library, but it is full of a quiet presence, a sense of accumulated time that presses gently on your skin. You approach the nearest lectern and look down at the book that rests there, a psalter with a binding of dark brown leather, its pages made of vellum that has yellowed to a warm cream colour, and you see that a fine layer of dust has settled on the top edge of the pages, fine as flour and undisturbed. You lift your hand and brush it away with the side of your thumb, the dust lifting into the air in a tiny cloud that catches the light and then disperses. This is the first of many small acts of care that will fill your days, and you feel a quiet satisfaction in it, the simple removal of dust from a page that has been waiting for you. The abbot had mentioned that the collection needed a careful hand, and as you walk the length of the room, you begin to understand the scope of the task ahead. There are perhaps 40 books in total, some of them chained to the lecterns with thin iron links that clink softly when you touch them, and others stored on a low shelf along the back wall, their spines turned outward but unlabelled. You run your finger along the shelf, leaving a trail in the dust, and you read the titles written in tiny script on the foredges. Works of scripture commentary mostly, a few liturgical texts with musical notation, a copy of the Rule of St. Benedict, and a thick volume of sermons by the Church Fathers that has a cracked spine and a loose gathering of pages slipping out at the front. You lift this one carefully, supporting its weight with both hands, and you place it on an empty lectern for later attention, making a mental note to re-sew the binding before the damage worsens. The abbot had also mentioned that you would need a ledger to record the collection, and so after your first slow circuit of the room you return to your cell to fetch the supplies you brought. A small bound notebook of blank parchment, a lead point for making temporary marks, and a larger quill with a pot of ink for the final entries. Back in the library, you settle yourself at a small table near the brazier, the warmth of the coals, a gentle presence at your side, and you open the notebook to the first page. You dip the quill into the ink pot, wiping the excess on the rim, and you write the date in your small, careful handwriting, the letters forming one by one as you press the quill to the parchment. Then you begin to list the books, starting at the lectern nearest the door and working your way around the room. The first book is the Psalter you already touched, and you open it gently to the title page where a scribe long ago wrote Psalmorum Liber in a neat, unhurried hand, the letters tall and upright, the ink a dark brown that has faded only slightly. You note the title, the approximate number of leaves, the condition of the binding, and any marks of damage. A small hole in one page where a flaw in the vellum opened up during stretching, a water stain on the lower margin of the last 10 leaves, a corner that has been bent back and creased. The second book is a gospel lectionary, its binding tool with a simple pattern of intersecting circles, and you turn each page slowly, listening to the soft rustle of the vellum, a sound like dry leaves stirring in a breeze. The third book is a gradual, with square namives drawn in red and black ink, the notes rising and falling across 4-line staves, and you pause to imagine the voices that have sung from these pages over the centuries. The same melodies repeated season after season in the choir below. You continue this way through the morning, moving from lectern to lectern, opening each book and recording its details with the same slow patience. The work is repetitive but not dull, each book a small world of its own with its own scent, its own weight, its own particular texture of paper or vellum. Some of the books are large and heavy, requiring both hands to lift, while others are small and fit easily in your palm, personal prayer books perhaps, made for a single user rather than the communal liturgy. You find a medical treatise from Salerno, its pages covered in recipes for salves and poultices written in a practical, unadorned script, and a book of natural philosophy that describes the properties of stones and herbs with simple line drawings in the margins. A tree with leaves like little teardrops, a fish with scales marked by tiny cross-hatched lines. Each book goes into the ledger, a line of ink that fixes its existence in the official record of the library, and by the time the bell rings for sext, you have completed the first half of the room. You eat your midday meal in the refectory, a bowl of pottage made from beans and leeks with a slice of bread, and then you return to the library for the afternoon. The light has shifted, the sun now coming through the western windows and casting a warmer tone on the floorboards, and you open the second set of shutters to let in a little more air. The dust motes dance in the new beams of light, a slow, continuous movement that you watch for a moment before turning back to the shelves. The remaining books include several volumes of a single large Bible, each book of scripture bound separately and stored in a wooden case lined with sheepskin, and you lift each one out carefully, checking the binding threads and the condition of the pages before recording them in the ledger. One volume, the Book of Isaiah, has a loose front cover that comes away in your hand, and you set it aside on the table with the broken book of sermons, a growing stack of patience awaiting your mending. As the afternoon wears on, you become aware of the sounds of the library in a deeper way, the tiny noises that make up its silence. The brazier coals settle with a soft clink, the shutters creak faintly as the wind moves outside, and a sparrow lands on the windowsill beyond the glass, its shape a dark blur that hops along the stone ledge and then flies away. You hear the distant scratch of a quill from the scriptorium, a room you have not yet entered, but which the abbot mentioned lies just off the library, and you realize that one of the scribes must be working there even now, copying a text with the same slow care you bring to your cataloguing. The thought is a comforting one, the knowledge that this room is part of a larger rhythm of making and keeping, writing and preserving, a rhythm that has continued here for 300 years. By the time the light begins to fade and the bell for Vespers sounds, you have finished your first pass through the entire collection. The ledger is filled with careful entries, each book accounted for, and you close it with a sense of quiet accomplishment. You walk through the library one more time, touching each lectern as you pass, straightening a chain that hangs slightly askew, aligning a corner of a parchment that is curled upward in the dry air, and you stop at the window to look out over the cloister. The brothers are filing into the church for evening prayer, their brown robes catching the last of the daylight, and you watch them until the door closes behind them and the courtyard is empty again. The library settles back into stillness, the brazier glowing softly in the corner, the books standing in their silent rows, and you know that this room is now yours to care for, a trust that asks nothing dramatic, only your steady presence, day after day. You spend the next several days repeating and deepening the work of that first exploration. You take the loose books to the small work table you have set up near the brazier, and you begin the slow process of cleaning them, wiping each leather binding with a soft cloth soaked in a little linseed oil, a treatment that the old librarian had noted on a scrap of parchment tucked into one of the shelves. The oil soaks into the dry leather, darkening it slightly and restoring a supple feel, and you rub it in small circles, letting the warmth of your hand help the oil penetrate. You brush the crumbs of ancient glue from the gutters of the pages, using a soft brush made of badger hair that you found in a drawer of the work table, and you repair small tears with a paste of wheat flour and water, pressing the edges together and weighting them with a smooth stone until they dry. The dusting becomes a daily ritual, a slow walk around the room with a cloth in your hand, brushing the tops of the books and the edges of the lecterns, the windowsills, the low shelf, the frame of the door. The dust is always there, fine and grey, and you come to accept that it is not an enemy to be defeated, but a condition of the room, a companion that settles as quietly as you do, and your task is simply to lift it away again and again, a patient cycle that mirrors the turning of the day. You sweep the floor each morning with a broom made of birch twigs that scratches gently against the wide oak boards, and you collect the sweepings into a small heap near the stairs, carrying them down in a wooden bucket to scatter in the garden where the wind will take them away. You learn the personality of each part of the room, the exact spot on the third lectern where the midday sun falls and warms the wood to a honey color, the whispery sound of a page turning when you open a book just far enough to catch the light, the particular creak of the seventh floorboard from the door, which always protests when you step on it in the morning but is silent in the afternoon. You learn to identify the books by their scent, the psalter that smells of frankincense from years of use in the church, the medical treatise that carries a faint medicinal sharpness of dried herbs pressed between its pages, the book of natural philosophy that has no scent at all except the clean, animal smell of old vellum. The library becomes a world unto itself, a space outside the regular flow of time, and you move through it each day with the same unhurried pace as the monks in the cloister below, your thoughts settling into the slow rhythm of dust and leather, ink and light, until the quiet of the room is no longer something you notice, but something you carry inside you, a stillness that goes with you when you descend the stairs at night and stays with you until you climb them again the next morning. One afternoon, perhaps 2 weeks after you first climbed the spiral stairs to the library, you are kneeling on the floor near the third lectern, reaching down to retrieve a lead point that has rolled from your hand and disappeared into the shadows beneath the shelf. Your fingers brush the cool oak boards, searching in the dim space where the light from the windows does not reach, and as you stretch a little farther, your knuckle knocks against a section of the floor that returns a hollow sound, a small, distinct thump that is different from the solid response of every other board you have touched. You pause, your hand suspended in the air, and then you lower it again and tap once more, deliberately this time, to confirm what you heard. The sound is unmistakable, a cavity beneath the floor, a space where there should be only packed earth and stone. You shift your position, bringing your face closer to the boards, and you run your fingers along the seam where 2 planks meet, searching for any irregularity. The dust here is thick, undisturbed for what must be a very long time, and as you brush it away with the side of your hand, you reveal a small iron ring set flush into the wood, almost invisible, its surface dark with age and worn smooth as if many fingers have pulled on it over the years. You sit back on your heels and look at the ring, a quiet discovery that raises no alarm but simply presents itself, a hidden thing waiting to be found by the right person at the right time. You do not pull it immediately. Instead you stand, brush the dust from the front of your robe, and walk to the window to think. The cloister garth below is empty, the afternoon light falling in long, slanted bars across the grass, and a single crow passes overhead, its shadow flickering briefly on the stone wall before it vanishes. You decide that you will ask the abbot about the ring before you explore further, a decision that comes not from fear, but from a sense that the library reveals its secrets in its own time, and that rushing ahead would be a kind of discourtesy to the room and its history. You find the abbot later that day in the kitchen garden, where he is walking slowly between the rows of leeks and cabbages, his hands clasped behind his back, and his gaze directed at the ground a few paces ahead of his feet. The evening is approaching, the air cooling, and a low mist has begun to gather in the hollows of the field beyond the monastery wall. You fall into step beside him without speaking at first, and you walk together in the silence that he seems to carry with him everywhere, a comfortable absence of words that asks nothing of you. When you do speak, your voice sounds small in the open air, and you describe what you found, the hollow sound, the iron ring, the dust that had settled over it for what must have been years. The abbot listens without interrupting, his pace never changing, and when you finish he nods slowly, the movement of his head a gentle acknowledgement of something he has been expecting to discuss for some time. He tells you that you are ready to know, and he leads you to the stone bench at the far end of the garden, the same bench where you sat together on your first evening at the monastery. The mist is thicker now, rising from the grass in thin, curling ribbons, and the abbot sits with his hands resting on his knees, his face turned toward the darkening hills on the horizon. His voice is low and steady as he explains what lies beneath the floorboard you discovered. Inside a lined wooden cupboard, no larger than a small chest, rests a collection of texts that the monastery has kept out of the general catalogue for generations, not because they are evil or dangerous in themselves, but because they contain ideas that some in the wider world might misunderstand, ideas that need a quiet, protected place to survive until the time is right for them to be read openly. He does not call them forbidden, a word that he seems to find too harsh, too full of conflict, but he calls them hidden, a softer term that speaks of preservation rather than prohibition. The abbot describes each of the hidden texts to you as the garden darkens around you, his words painting the images of them in your mind long before you will see them with your own eyes. There is a work of geometry from the ancient world, a treatise written in Greek and later translated into Latin by a scholar in Toledo. Its pages filled with diagrams of triangles and circles and the precise relationships between them, a map of pure reason drawn in ink. There is a treatise on the movement of the stars based on observations made over many decades by a group of astronomers in a desert observatory, recording the slow dance of the planets against the fixed background of the constellations, a patient accounting of the heavens that contradicts no faith but simply describes what the eye can see. There is a medical compendium from a physician of Cordoba, a thick volume that catalogues hundreds of remedies derived from plants and minerals, a bridge between the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and the practices of the healers in the great cities of the south, and its pages are annotated in a tiny, precise hand by a monk who tested many of the remedies in the monastery infirmary long ago. Finally, there are a few poems, short works written in a flowing musical Latin that speak of the natural world in terms of direct observation rather than allegory, describing the exact shade of green in a spring leaf, the precise pattern of ripples on a pond when a fish rises, the feeling of sunlight on skin after a long winter, small celebrations of the physical world that needed no higher interpretation to be beautiful. The abbot falls silent after this, and you sit together in the gathering dark while the little owl in the bell tower begins its nightly calling, the soft repeated note that has become as familiar to you as your own breathing. Then he turns to you and asks you to care for these hidden books, to keep them dry and free of bookworms, to check their bindings once each season, and to know them well enough that they are not lost to time, a trust that he places in your hands with the same quiet simplicity as everything else in this place, precipitancy as everything else in this place. You agree with a simple nod, a gesture that feels more binding than any spoken oath, and the abbot places his hand briefly on your shoulder before rising and walking back toward the church for Compline, his figure soon swallowed by the mist. The next morning, you climb the library stairs with a small oil lamp in your hand, its flame steady and yellow behind the thin pane of horn that shields it from draughts. The library is still dark at this early hour, the windows showing only the faintest grey hint at the coming dawn, and you move through the familiar space by memory and lamplight, your shadow swaying gently on the walls. You kneel beside the hidden ring, setting the lamp on the floor beside you, and you hook your finger through the cool iron circle. The board lifts easily, as if it has been waiting for this moment, rising on hidden hinges that have been kept oiled by some careful hand in the past, and beneath it you see a cavity lined with smooth planks of cedar, a wood that repels insects and gives off a faint, pleasant scent as the lid opens. Inside the cavity rests a wooden cupboard no larger than the chest in your cell, its lid fitted with a simple iron latch that opens at your touch. You lift the lid slowly, and there, arranged in a neat stack with their spines facing upward, are the hidden books, exactly as the abbot described them. The lamplight falls on their leather bindings, some dark with age, others a lighter brown that has been protected from the sun by the darkness of the cupboard, and you reach down and lift out the topmost volume with both hands, cradling it as you would a small animal. It is the work of geometry, its binding plain and unadorned, and when you open it to the first page you see a diagram of a circle divided into equal parts by a series of intersecting lines, the ink still dark and sharp after all these years. You turn a few pages, finding triangles and squares and more complex shapes that you do not have the knowledge to name, and then you close the book gently and set it aside on the floor beside the lamp. The second book is the treatise on the stars, and its pages are filled with tables of numbers arranged in long columns, the positions of the planets recorded at different dates and times, a vast, quiet catalogue of celestial motion. The handwriting here is smaller than in the geometry text, more compressed, as if the scribe wanted to fit as much information as possible onto each page. And you imagine him sitting at a desk in some distant observatory, his eyes moving from the night sky to the parchment and back again, recording the slow drift of the heavens, one careful entry at a time. The medical compendium is the thickest of the hidden books, its pages soft and worn from use, and as you leaf through it you find the annotations the abbot mentioned, tiny notes in the margin written in a different ink, recording the results of remedies tested in the monastery garden, a record of practical knowledge passed from one healer to another across the years. The poems come last, a slim volume of only a few dozen pages, and you read the first one by the light of the lamp, your lips moving silently over the words. The poet describes a beech tree in early spring, the exact shade of green in the new leaves, the way the light filters through them and dapples the ground below, the texture of the smooth grey bark under his hand. There is no hidden meaning, no allegorical reference to virtue or vice, only the tree itself, recorded with a careful, loving attention that makes the world feel larger and more detailed than it did before you read the words. You close the book and hold it in your lap for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the smallness of it, this fragile container of a moment that happened long ago and is now preserved here in the dark. You spend the rest of that morning examining each of the hidden books in turn, noting their condition in a separate section of the ledger that you will keep private, a record known only to you and the abbot. The bindings are all in good repair, the cedar lining of the cupboard having done its work well, and you find no sign of bookworms or damp or any other harm. You place small linen bags of dried lavender and rosemary between the volumes, the same herbs you use in the main library, and you check that the iron ring is seated properly in its recess so that no one will notice it unless they are looking very carefully. Then you lower the board back into place, hearing the soft thud as it settles into its frame, and you spread a thin layer of dust over the seam with your fingers, a small precaution that makes the hiding place even more invisible. From that day forward, the hidden cupboard becomes a quiet center of your daily round, a responsibility that never raises its voice but simply waits for you, calm and patient as a sleeping cat. Each morning, after you have opened the windows and lit the brazier and made your first slow circuit of the library, you kneel beside the third lectern and lift the ring, peering inside to see that all is well, that no mouse has found its way into the cedar-lined space, that the lavender bags are still fragrant and the books are resting as you left them. You do this without hurry, without any sense of secrecy as a burden, because the hiding is not a thing of fear, but a thing of tenderness, a way of letting the books rest until the world is ready to receive them without fuss. You check their bindings at the turn of each season, as the abbot asked, running your fingers along the spines to feel for any looseness, any crack in the leather, any thread that has begun to fray, and you make small repairs with the same care you give to the books on the lecterns, a stitch here, a dab of paste there, the work so quiet and so slow that it becomes a kind of meditation. The hidden books never leave the cupboard, never see the light of day, but you come to know them as well as you know any of the volumes on the shelves above, their titles, their authors, the particular way each one feels in your hands when you lift it out for its seasonal inspection. The geometry text is the heaviest, its pages made of a thick vellum that resists your fingers slightly when you turn them. The star treatise is the lightest, its pages thin and almost transparent, the numbers on the reverse side showing through as faint shadows. The medical compendium smells of the herbs whose remedies it describes, lavender and chamomile and something sharper that you cannot identify, and the poems have a faint trace of something sweet, perhaps a residue of honey used in the binding paste long ago. These details become as familiar to you as the creak of the floorboards and the pattern of the light on the third lectern, part of the quiet fabric of your days, and you carry the knowledge of the hidden cupboard with you wherever you go in the monastery, a small, warm secret that asks nothing of you but your steady, patient attention. The bell for vigils rings in the deepest part of the night, a single low note that rises up through the stones and finds you in your sleep, nudging you gently toward the surface of waking. You do not rise immediately, because your work in the library is considered a form of prayer in itself, and the abbot has given you leave to attend the offices only when you wish. But the sound of the bell enters your dreams anyway, a steady vibration that becomes the tolling of a sunken bell in a green underwater world before you open your eyes and recognize it for what it is. You lie still in the darkness of your cell, feeling the rough wool blanket against your chin, hearing the distant shuffle of the brothers as they rise in their own cells and make their way down the stone stairs to the church. Their footsteps are a soft, continuous murmur, a low river of sound that flows along the corridor and fades into the lower floor. And then the monastery settles back into a deeper quiet, the silence that follows the community into the choir stalls, where the chanting will soon begin. You wait until the last echo of the bell has dissolved completely, and then you push back the blanket and swing your legs over the side of the narrow bed, your bare feet finding the cool wood of the floor. The air in the cell is cold, carrying the particular chill of a stone building that has radiated its heat into the night, and you move quickly to the basin on the ledge by the door, pouring water from the earthenware pitcher into the shallow bowl. The water is so cold it makes your fingers ache as you splash it onto your face, cupping it in your palms and pressing it against your closed eyes, your forehead, the back of your neck where the hair is beginning to grow a little long. You dry your skin with a rough linen towel that hangs beside the basin, the cloth scratchy and smelling faintly of the lavender that the brothers tuck into the linen chest. And then you dress in the near darkness, pulling your wool tunic over your head, fastening the leather belt around your waist, slipping your feet into the wooden clogs that wait beside the bed. The window in your cell shows only the faintest change in the quality of the dark, a slight thinning of the blackness that suggests the night is beginning to loosen its hold, and you know without looking at any timepiece that the sky outside is still deep indigo, with a faint lemon rind of dawn just beginning to show on the eastern hills. You have seen this particular moment of the morning many times now, and it has become a familiar companion. The threshold between the last of the night and the first of the day, when the world holds its breath and nothing moves except the slow turning of the stars toward the horizon. You take your small oil lamp from the shelf, light it with a spill from the banked coals of the kitchen fire that you passed on your way from the dormitory, and you carry it before you as you descend the spiral stairs and step out into the cloister walk. The cloister at this hour is a study in shades of grey, the stone arches repeating into the distance like a tunnel of shadows, the grass of the garth, a dark wet carpet, the well in the centre, a deeper blackness against the sky. A light mist drifts just above the ground, moving slowly through the archways as if it has a mind of its own, and you walk through it without disturbing its path, your clogs making a soft, rhythmic sound on the worn flagstones. The air is cool and damp and carries the smell of wet stone, crushed herbs from the garden, and a faint trace of incense that has seeped into the walls of the church over centuries of worship. You pass the door to the church, where the voices of the brothers are rising and falling in the slow chant of the psalms, a sound so familiar that you no longer hear the individual words, only the rise and fall of the melody, a continuous wave that washes against the stones and recedes and washes again. You do not stop, but you let the sound accompany you as you walk the length of the cloister to the eastern end, where the chapter house door stands open and the spiral staircase waits to carry you up into the library. The library at this hour is a place of deep shadow and absolute stillness, the tall windows showing only the palest grey rectangles against the far wall, the lecterns invisible in the dark except as darker shapes against the darkness. You pause at the top of the stairs, holding your lamp high, so that its small circle of yellow light pushes back the shadows just enough for you to see the first few paces ahead, and then you move forward into the room, setting the lamp on the work table near the brazier. The coals in the brazier have died down to a fine grey ash, and the air in the room is cold, carrying the faint, clean scent of old vellum and beeswax, and the dry, woody smell of the charcoal dust. Your first task of the day is always the same, to open the windows just a crack, a narrow gap that will let the cool morning air move gently through the room without stirring the pages left open on the lecterns. You walk to each window in turn, beginning with the one nearest the stairs and working your way along the eastern wall, and at each embrasure you release the iron latch and push the wooden frame outward by the width of your hand, feeling the cold air slide past your face and into the library with a soft, almost inaudible sigh. The light outside is growing now, the deep indigo of the sky paling to a soft lavender at the horizon, and you can see the outlines of the hills against the brightening east, their slopes dark with trees and their tops crowned with a thin line of gold where the sun is just beginning to rise. You stand at the last window for a moment, watching the mist in the cloister garth below as it begins to lift, thinning into wisps that curl around the well and drift up over the roof of the church, and then you turn back to the room and your next task. The brazier needs to be lit, and you gather the materials for this with the same slow, practiced motions every morning. You take the iron bucket from beside the hearth and descend the spiral stairs to the kitchen, where the cook brother is already at work kneading dough for the day's bread, his hands moving in a steady rhythm on the floured board. He glances up as you enter, gives a small nod, and gestures toward the fire with his chin, and you take a long wooden spill and hold it in the flames until the tip glows orange and curls into a thin line of smoke. Back in the library, you place a small handful of fresh charcoal into the brazier, arranging the pieces in a loose pile, and you touch the burning spill to the edge of one lump, holding it there until the charcoal catches and begins to glow. The smoke rises in a thin, pale column, curling upward into the flue, and the smell of it fills the room, a sharp, clean scent that mingles with the cold air and the beeswax and the old vellum. You add a few more pieces of charcoal, watching the glow spread from one lump to the next, and then you fit the small iron lid loosely over the coals, leaving a gap for the air to flow through, and you settle into the quiet satisfaction of having brought warmth into the room with your own hands. Now begins the true morning round, the slow circuit of the library that you've come to know as intimately as your own breathing. You walk the length of the room, your footsteps following the same path they follow every day, a route that takes you past each lectern in order, and you let your hand rest for a moment on the edge of each one as you pass, a light touch that checks for dust, for dampness, for any small change from the day before. The first lectern holds the heavy psalter with the iron chain, and you pause here to lift the chain and run it through your fingers, feeling for any rough spot that might snag the pages, any link that has begun to wear thin and might need the attention of the monastery smith. The chain is cool and smooth, the iron dark with age, and you lay it back down carefully, arranging it in a loose coil beside the book so that it does not press against the binding. The second lectern holds the Gospel lectionary, and here you notice that one corner of the upper parchment has curled slightly in the dry air of the night, lifting away from the page beneath it. You place your thumb gently on the curled corner and press it back into place, holding it for a count of 10, while the vellum absorbs the warmth of your hand and relaxes. And then you lift your thumb to see that the corner lies flat again, obedient and smooth. The third lectern is the one that catches the first direct sunlight on clear mornings, and you pause here to check the hidden cupboard, kneeling on the floor with the same quiet motion you have practiced every day since the abbot entrusted you with its secret. You find the seam of the floorboard, brush away the thin layer of dust that has settled overnight, and hook your finger through the iron ring, lifting the board on its silent hinges. The lamplight falls into the cedar-lined cavity, illuminating the stacked books with their dark leather spines, the small linen bags of lavender and rosemary tucked between them, and you peer inside to see that all is well, that no mouse has found its way through the tiny gaps in the floor, that no dampness has crept into the wood, that the books rest exactly as you left them the evening before. You lower the board back into place, press it down until it sits flush with the surrounding floor, and brush a new scattering of dust across the seam with your fingertips, a small act of concealment that has become as natural as breathing. The remaining lecterns receive the same quiet attention as you continue your circuit. The Book of Natural Philosophy with its line drawings of trees and fish, the medical treatise with its recipes for salves written in that practical, unadorned hand, the Gradual with its square neumes marching across the four-line staves like tiny black flags, the thick volume of sermons with the repaired binding that you check for any sign of new cracking. At each stop you straighten a book, a line of parchment, brush away a speck of dust that has settled on the wood, And you do all of this without hurry, without any sense of a task to be completed, because the morning round is not a task, but a rhythm, a slow lap around a world made of ink and skin and time that asks nothing more of you than your presence and your steady hands. By the time you reach the last lectern, the one nearest the door to the scriptorium, the light outside has changed completely. The sun has climbed fully over the eastern hills, and its first direct rays are slanting through the high windows, falling in long golden bars across the floorboards and catching the dust motes that hang in the air, making them sparkle like tiny flecks of mica. The warmth of the sun is just beginning to compete with the warmth of the brazier, and the room is filling with that particular quality of morning light that makes the leather bindings glow a rich, deep brown and turns the vellum pages to a soft, buttery cream. From the cloister below, you hear the sound of the bell ringing again, this time for prime, the first office of the full day, and the brothers who attended vigils and then returned to their cells for a brief rest are now filing out again, their sandals brushing the flagstones, their voices silent but their presence a gentle stir of movement that you can sense through the stones. You walk to the window and look down at the cloister walk, watching the brown-robed figures move in their slow, unhurried procession toward the church, their hands tucked into their sleeves and their heads bowed, and you feel a quiet kinship with them even though your work keeps you apart. They sing the hours in the choir stalls, and you tend the books in the library, but both tasks are part of the same great, slow rhythm, a rhythm that has continued here for 300 years and will continue long after you and all these brothers have returned to the earth. The last of the monks disappears through the church door, and the cloister falls empty and still, the mist now completely burned away by the sun, the grass of the garth a vivid green, the well casting a short, sharp shadow across the paving stones. You turn back to the library, to your completed morning round, to the lecterns standing in their quiet rows, and the books resting on their angled surfaces, ready for another day of silent preservation. The brazier glows softly in the corner, the windows are open, a crack to the cool air, the hidden cupboard is secure beneath its dusted seam, and everything in the room is exactly as it should be, held in a perfect, temporary balance that will need tending again by evening, but for now simply exists, calm and whole. You sit down at your work table, taking up the ledger and opening it to the page where you record the daily condition of the collection. And you dip your quill into the ink pot, writing a single line in your small, careful hand. All is well. The morning round complete. The library at peace. Then you set the quill back in its pot, fold your hands on the table, and let the silence of the room settle over you like a second blanket, warm and weightless, and full of the quiet light of the risen sun. The scriptorium is a small room set off the main library, reached by a low arched doorway that you pass each time you walk from the work table to the far window. For the first weeks of your time as librarian, you had walked past this door without opening it, focused on the books already in your care, the dusting and the cataloguing, and the quiet tending of the hidden cupboard. But the scriptorium is part of the library's life, a place where new books are made even as you preserve the old ones, and on a morning when the light is particularly fine, a clear, steady light from the south that makes every detail of the floorboards visible, you decide that it is time to make the room ready for the scribes who will soon return to their winter work. The door swings open on iron hinges that have been kept well oiled by some previous hand, and you step into a room that is smaller and more intimate than the main library, its ceiling lower, its single large window facing south to catch the best steady light for copying. The window is set high in the wall and fitted with clear glass rather than the thick, greenish panes of the eastern windows, a luxury that must have cost the monastery dearly when it was installed. Below the window, 4 high, angled desks stand in a row, their surfaces worn to a smooth, golden polish by the sleeves of countless scribes who have leaned over their work across the centuries. The desks are set at a slant, the perfect angle to hold a sheet of parchment steady while a quill moves across it, and each desk has a small ledge at the bottom to prevent the page from slipping, a simple design that has served the community for as long as anyone can remember. The room is dusty, a fine grey layer covering the desks and the stools that sit before them, and you spend the first part of the morning cleaning it with the same slow, methodical care you give to the main library. You wipe the desks with a damp cloth, the water darkening the wood for a moment before it dries and leaves behind a clean, warm surface that smells faintly of old beeswax. You sweep the floor with the birch twig broom, the twigs scratching softly on the wide boards, and you collect a small heap of dust and a few dried leaves that have blown in through the window during the warm months. The stools you examine one by one, checking for loose joints or splinters, and you find that the third stool has a small crack in its seat that you will need to ask the monastery carpenter to look at before the scribe's return. You make a mental note of this, adding it to the quiet list of small repairs that you carry in your mind, a list that never grows shorter but never becomes urgent either, each item simply waiting its turn. When the room is clean, you turn your attention to the materials that the scribes will need, the ink and the quills and the parchment that are the raw stuff of the scriptorium's work. The ink begins with oak galls, small hard spheres that grow on the twigs of oak trees and contain a dark tannic heart. A basket of these galls sits in the corner of the scriptorium, collected by a brother who walks the monastery woods each autumn, and you take a handful and carry them to the work table in the main library, where you have set up a small preparation area near the brazier. You place the galls in a shallow wooden bowl, and with the mortar and pestle that you keep on a shelf beside the table, you begin to crush them, pressing the heavy stone pestle down onto the hard little spheres and grinding them in a slow circular motion. The galls crack and splinter under the pressure, releasing a faint, sharp scent that is not unpleasant, a dry, astringent smell that reminds you of autumn leaves and the bark of old trees. You grind them until they are reduced to a coarse, dark powder, and then you scrape this powder into a small iron pot with a wooden spatula. To the powder, you add rainwater that you have collected from the barrel outside the kitchen door, a soft water that is free of the minerals that might cloud the finished ink. You pour it slowly, measuring by eye until the powder is just covered, and then you set the iron pot on a trivet over the brazier, where the coals glow a steady orange and the heat is gentle and even. The mixture begins to simmer almost immediately, small bubbles rising to the surface and breaking with a soft planking sound, and you stir it with a twig of hazel, watching the water darken from a pale tan to a deeper brown, the color of strong tea, and then to a rich, nearly black hue. The simmering goes on for a long time, the liquid reducing slowly, the scent of it filling the library with an earthy, woody fragrance that mingles with the beeswax and the old vellum, and you sit beside the brazier on a low stool, stirring occasionally, listening to the soft bubble of the ink and the crackle of the coals, letting the afternoon pass in this quiet, steady work. When the liquid has reduced by half and reached a deep, dark color, you remove the pot from the heat and let it cool for a time, the steam rising in thin, curling wisps. Then you take a small lump of gum arabic from the jar on the shelf, a dried crystalline sap that the monastery purchases from a trader who comes up the hill once each year with a cart full of goods from the south. The gum arabic is pale gold and translucent, and you crush it with a mortar and pestle until it is a fine powder, then stir it into the cooled ink a little at a time, watching it dissolve and thicken the liquid, giving it a smooth, glossy body that will flow evenly from the nib of a quill. You test the ink by dipping the tip of a trimmed feather into the pot and making a few strokes on a scrap of vellum, the ink laying down in a clean, dark line that dries quickly to a matte black, and you nod to yourself, satisfied. The finished ink is poured into a small clay pot with a cork stopper, and you label it with a slip of parchment that reads Oak Gall Black, the writing in your own small, careful hand. The quills come next, and this is a task that you find particularly pleasing in its quiet, repetitive nature. The kitchen brother has left a bundle of goose feathers on the shelf outside the library door, the large, stiff flight feathers from the wings that make the best writing instruments. You sort through the bundle, selecting the feathers that are straight and undamaged, discarding the few that are bent or split, and you lay out the chosen ones in a neat row on the work table. Each quill must be trimmed before it can be used, the shaft cut at a careful angle to form a nib that will hold the ink and release it smoothly onto the parchment. You take your small knife, the one with the curved blade that you keep sharp on a whetstone, and you make the first cut at the base of the shaft, slicing upward at a shallow angle to create a long, pointed tip. Then you make a second cut on the opposite side, a shorter one, to create a split nib that will flex slightly under the pressure of the scribe's hand, and you trim the very tip to a fine point, testing it on the scrap of vellum until it produces a line that is clean and even without scratching or blotting. You trim quills for the better part of an hour. The work so repetitive and so absorbing that you lose track of time, your hands moving through the familiar motions while your mind drifts into a quiet, unfocused state. The pile of trimmed quills grows beside you, the feathers are soft grey-white, the cut shafts pale and clean, and when you have enough for all 4 desks, you gather them into a clay pot filled with dry sand, where they will stand upright and ready for the scribes to take. The scraps from the trimming, the feathery barbs, and the small pieces of cut shaft you sweep into your palm and carry to the brazier, where they flare up in a brief bright flame and are gone. The parchment that the scribes will use comes from a workshop in the town at the bottom of the hill, where a family of parchmenters has been producing sheets of vellum for the monastery for many generations. A new bundle arrives every few months, carried up the hill on the back of a donkey, and it is stored in a wooden chest in the corner of the scriptorium, the sheets laid flat between boards of cedar to keep them from curling. You open the chest and inspect the top sheets, checking for any flaws, a hole where a flaw in the skin opened up during stretching, a thin spot where the scraper went too deep, a grease stain that would repel the ink. The sheets are good, smooth and even, and a warm cream color, and you run your hand over the surface of the top one, feeling the soft velvety texture of the vellum, a texture that has been prepared through weeks of soaking and liming and scraping and drying, a long, slow process that you respect, even though you do not know its details. The scribes arrive after Terci on the first day of the winter copying season, 3 older men who have been working in the scriptorium for longer than anyone can remember. They come up the spiral stairs with the slow, careful steps of men who were no longer young, their brown robes dusty at the hems from the cloister walk, and they nod to you as they pass through the main library, a silent greeting that you return with a small inclination of your head. They take their places at the high-angled desks, settling onto the stools with soft sighs of effort, and they arrange their materials around them. The ink pots, the quills standing in the sand-filled pots, the sheets of parchment taken from the chest and laid flat on the slanted surfaces, the rulers and the lead points and the small knives for scraping away mistakes. The scribes begin their work without any fuss, their quills dipping into the ink pots and then moving across the parchment in smooth, unhurried strokes, and the scriptorium fills with the tiny repetitive sounds of their labor, the soft scratch of quill on vellum, the occasional clink of a knife being set down on a desk, the faint rustle of a page being turned. The oldest of the 3, a brother named Anselm with a fringe of white hair and fingers that are knotted at the joints, is copying a psalter for a new monastery that has been founded in a valley 3 days' walk to the north. The second brother, whose name you have not yet learned, is working on a gradual, drawing the square numes with a careful, precise hand that never wavers. The third is repairing an old antiphona, scraping away the faded ink of a particular page with a small, sharp blade so that the vellum can be reused, a practice that is common when new parchment is scarce. You watch them from your chair near the door, the way their heads tilt slightly in concentration, the way the light from the south window falls on the pages and slowly travels as the hours pass, a patch of sunshine that creeps from the edge of one desk to the next, measuring the morning in its own silent way. The scriptorium on these winter days is a place of deep, focused stillness, a stillness that is different from the stillness of the main library, but complementary to it, a stillness full of small, purposeful movements rather than absolute quiet. You find that you enjoy being in the presence of the scribes, even though you do not speak to them, and you bring them small things that they might need, a fresh pot of ink when the old one runs low, a newly trimmed quill when a nib wears down and becomes blunt, a cup of water from the well when the afternoon grows long, and the air in the room grows long, and the air in the room grows long, and the air in the room grows warm from the brazier. You watch the slow transfer of knowledge from ink to page, word by word, letter by letter, a river of text that flows from the minds of the scribes through their hands and onto the waiting vellum, and you understand that this is the other half of your work, the making that balances the keeping. the new that balances the old. The library holds the books that have already been written, and the scriptorium writes the books that will be held, and the two rooms breathe together like two lungs, a quiet, steady rhythm that fills the days and the months and the years with meaning. The mending of bindings occupies the long, quiet hours of many afternoons, a task that requires no haste and rewards the slow accumulation of small, careful movements. On the work table near the brazier, where the light from the eastern windows falls in a steady, diffused glow through the winter months, you have set up a dedicated space for this work. A space that holds your sewing frame, your bone folder, your waxed thread, your pot of wheat paste, your curved needles, and a small collection of leather scraps saved from previous repairs. The books that need your attention wait in a stack beside the table, their spines cracked, their gatherings loose, their covers hanging by threads or entirely detached, and you work through them one by one at the pace of the season, which is to say, slowly, with no deadline and no sense of urgency beyond the quiet knowledge that each repair will extend the life of the book by another generation or two. A book that needs rebinding comes to you in a state of gentle disassembly. The first step is always to remove the damaged binding completely, a process that feels less like destruction and more like a careful unwrapping, a peeling back of the layers that time and use have worn thin. You take the book in your hands, feeling its weight, noting where the leather has cracked, where the sewing has pulled away from the cords, where the boards have warped or split. With a small knife, the same curved blade you use for trimming quills, you cut through the old thread that holds the gatherings to the covers, slicing each stitch with a single, controlled motion that leaves the parchment pages unharmed. The old thread comes away in your fingers, dry and brittle, and you set it aside in a small pile that you will later add to the brazier, watching it flare and vanish. The leather cover, loosened from its moorings, is lifted away from the boards with a bone folder, the flat, polished tools sliding between leather and wood with a soft, whispering friction. You work the folder gently around the edges, loosening the old paste, a substance that was once made of the same wheat flour and water you use today, applied by a binder who lived 100 years ago or more, and who never imagined that his work would be taken apart and renewed by hands like yours. When the cover is removed, the bare boards lie exposed. Two rectangles of oak or beech that have protected the pages for centuries and that show the marks of their age in the darkening of the wood. The small wormholes that trace a wandering path across the surface, the notches cut to receive the sewing cords. You inspect the boards carefully, checking for cracks that might need the attention of a carpenter, checking for the soft, crumbly texture of wood that has begun to rot from damp. Most of the boards are still sound, and you set them aside, brushing the old paste dust from their surfaces with a soft cloth. If a board is too damaged to reuse, you will take it down to the monastery's carpentry workshop, where the brother who makes the furniture will cut a new one to the exact same dimensions, a task he performs with the same quiet, meticulous care he brings to everything he builds. The real heart of the binding work lies in the gatherings, the bundles of folded parchment pages that make up the body of the book. A gathering is formed by taking a single large sheet of vellum and folding it once, twice, sometimes 3 times, creating a section of 4, 8, or 16 pages that nest inside one another. Several gatherings are then stacked together and sewn onto cords to form the complete book block, the whole held together by the tension of the thread and the grip of the cords on the spine. When a binding fails, it is usually because the sewing thread has broken or the cords have pulled loose and the gatherings separate from one another, spilling out of the cover like a sheaf of fallen leaves. Your task is to gather these leaves and restore them to their proper order, then sew them back into a unified block. You begin by arranging the loose gatherings on the work table, sorting them by the small marks that the original scribe left on the bottom margin of each section's first page, a letter or a Roman numeral that indicates the correct sequence. These marks, called signatures, are often faint, written in a pale ink that has faded with time, and you hold the pages close to the lamp to read them, your finger tracing the tiny strokes of the long-dead scribe's quill. You put the gatherings in order, first signature to last, and you stack them neatly, tapping the edges against the tabletop to align them. Each gathering is inspected for torn pages, and any tears are mended with a thin strip of vellum pasted over the damaged area, the repair so thin and so carefully applied that it becomes almost invisible once the book is closed. You check the gutters, the folded centers of the gatherings, where the sewing will pass through, making sure that the folds are crisp and that no pages have shifted out of alignment. If a fold has weakened, you sharpen it by running the bone folder along the crease, pressing down with a steady, even pressure that leaves the fold clean and sharp. The gatherings are now ready for sewing, and you bring out the sewing frame, a simple wooden device consisting of a flat base, 2 upright posts, and a horizontal bar across the top that can be adjusted to different heights. From the horizontal bar you suspend the cords, lengths of stout linen twine that will run vertically across the spine of the book and provide the anchor for the sewing. You tie the cords to the bar at the top, then thread them through holes in the base so that they stand taut and parallel, spaced at intervals that match the notches in the boards. The number of cords depends on the size of the book, 3 for a small prayer book, 5 for a large psalter, and you measure the spacing with a ruler marked in thumb widths, adjusting each cord until it stands straight and true. Before you begin to sew, you prepare the thread, a length of fine linen cord that you cut from a spool and run through a lump of beeswax held between your fingers. The waxing is a slow, repetitive motion, the thread drawn back and forth through the wax until it is coated with a thin, glossy layer that will protect it from fraying and help it slide smoothly through the parchment. The beeswax comes from the monastery's own hives, a pale golden lump that smells of honey and summer flowers, and as you work it into the thread, the scent rises around you, sweet and clean. You thread the waxed cord through a curved needle, the needle's eye just large enough to receive the cord, and you are ready to begin. Sewing a book is a rhythmic, meditative process that follows a pattern as old as the codex itself. You take the first gathering, open it to the center fold, and lay it against the cord so that the cords lie along the outside of the fold, running parallel to the spine. The needle enters the fold from the outside, passes through the center of the gathering, and emerges at the first cord, where you loop the thread around the cord and pull it snug but not tight, so the pages can still breathe and lie flat when the book is opened. The needle then goes back into the fold, traveling to the next cord, where you loop the thread again and so on across the width of the spine until you reach the far edge. At this point, you tie off the thread with a small knot, tucking the end inside the gathering, and you take up the second gathering, placing it on top of the first and repeating the pattern, sewing through the fold and looping around each cord in turn. The needle pushes through the old sewing holes with a slight resistance, and you feel the thread pull taut, the waxed linen sliding smoothly through the parchment, and the sound it makes is a soft, continuous whisper, a hush that fills the quiet air of the library. You sew gathering after gathering, each one added to the stack, the book block growing thicker under your hands, and the rhythm of the work pulls you into a state of calm, focused attention in which nothing exists except the needle, the thread, the cords, and the steady accumulation of pages. Your fingers learn the texture of each gathering, some of them thicker where the vellum is heavier, others thinner where the parchment was scraped to a finer finish, and you adjust the tension of the thread accordingly, pulling a little looser on the thick gatherings so that the spine does not become too tight, a little firmer on the thin ones so that they do not sag. The sewing takes time, an hour or more for a large book, but you never notice the passage of that time, because the work itself is its own measure, a slow, steady progress that is complete when the last gathering is sewn and the final knot is tied and tucked away inside the fold. With the sewing finished, the book block is a solid, unified object, but the spine is still raw and unfinished, the gatherings standing slightly proud, the cords trailing from the back like loose threads from a loom. The next step is to consolidate the spine, a process that begins with the application of a layer of wheat paste. You mix the paste, fresh each time you need it, scooping a small amount of wheat flour into a clay dish and adding water a few drops at a time, stirring with a wooden spatula until the mixture reaches the consistency of thick cream. The paste has a mild, bready scent, and you spread it along the spine with a flat brush made of hod bristle, working it into the spaces between the gatherings, covering the sewing threads and the cords, smoothing it with your finger until the spine is even and uniform. While the paste is still wet, you press a strip of linen cloth over the spine, a reinforcement that will add strength and flexibility, and you rub it down with the bone folder until it adheres without bubbles or wrinkles. The book block is now set aside to dry, placed under a weighted board that presses the gatherings together and ensures that the spine sets straight and firm. You check it every few hours, lifting the board and running your thumb along the spine to feel for any dampness, any unevenness, any spot where the paste has pulled and needs to be smoothed away. The drying takes a full day, sometimes two if the air is damp, and during this time the book rests on the work table like a patient recovering from a long illness, quiet and still, while you turn your attention to other tasks, the dusting, the tending of the brazier, the preparation of ink for the scriptorium. When the spine is dry, you prepare the boards that will form the covers. The old boards, if they are sound, are cleaned of any remaining old leather and paste, scraped gently with the edge of your knife until the wood is bare and smooth. The notches that will receive the cords are cleared of debris, and you test fit the boards against the book block, checking that the cords align perfectly with the notches, that the boards extend slightly beyond the edges of the pages to protect them, that the whole assembly sits square and true. If the old boards cannot be reused, the new ones are trimmed to size, their edges beveled with a plane, their surfaces sanded smooth, and you drill the holes for the cords with a small auger, the drill bit turning slowly through the wood with a soft, grinding sound. The cords that trail from the spine are threaded through the holes in the boards, pulled tight and secured with wooden pegs hammered into the holes, the pegs cut from a dowel of hard oak and tapped in with a small mallet until they sit flush with the surface of the board. You trim the excess cord with your knife, and the book block and boards are now one connected whole, the skeleton of the book complete and strong. The final covering is the leather, a piece of calfskin or goatskin tanned in the village down the hill, where a tanner works the hides in pits of oak bark and water, a process that takes many months and yields a leather that is supple, durable, and a warm, rich brown in color. You select a piece of leather from the stack on the shelf, measuring it against the book, cutting it with shears to a size that will wrap around the boards and overlap the edges by the width of 2 fingers. The leather is pasted onto the boards with the same wheat paste, applied in a thin, even layer, and you work quickly but calmly, laying the leather down over the spine first, smoothing it into the contours between the cords with the bone folder, then drawing it over the boards, rubbing it firmly so that the paste grips and the leather adheres without any bubbles or loose spots. The corners are folded in neat triangles, the edges turned over the boards and pasted down on the inside, and you work the bone folder into every crease and fold, the tool sliding over the leather with a soft, almost musical friction. The covered book is then set under the weighted board once more, where it will rest for another day while the paste dries and the leather tightens around the boards, conforming to the shape of the book block, becoming a second skin that will protect the pages for another 100 years or more. The final step, after the book has dried and you have inspected every seam and corner, is to return it to its place in the library, either on a lectern or on the low shelf along the back wall. You carry the book in both hands, feeling the solid weight of it, the smooth leather, the firm spine, the quiet promise of its renewed strength. You place it gently where it belongs, and you open it once to check that the pages lie flat, that the spine flexes without cracking, that the sewing holds true. Then you close it, fasten the clasp if it has one, and step back, looking at the book among its companions, a small monument to the patient work of preservation. A work that no one else will ever notice or praise, but that you know has been done with care and with a quiet love for the object itself, for its past and its future, for the words it carries and the hands that will hold it long after you are gone. Beyond the infirmary wall, on the south side of the monastery where the sunlight lingers longest, there is a small enclosed garden dedicated to the plants that supply your work. The garden is not large, perhaps 20 paces long and 12 wide, but it is carefully laid out in rectangular beds divided by narrow paths of packed gravel that crunch softly underfoot when you walk them. A low stone wall surrounds the space, its top capstones worn smooth by weather and by the hands of gardeners long gone, and in the center a small stone basin collects rainwater that spills over from a lead pipe connected to the cloister roof. The air here is always slightly warmer than in the open fields, sheltered from the wind by the infirmary on one side and the high outer wall on the other, and the herbs grow thick and green even in the late autumn when the rest of the valley has turned brown and bare. You come to this garden once each day, usually in the late morning after the morning round is complete and before the sun has climbed too high and made the work uncomfortable. The path from the library leads you down the spiral stairs, across the cloister walk, past the refectory where the kitchen brother is already preparing the midday meal, and through a small wooden gate that latches with a simple hook of iron. The gate swings open silently, its hinges kept oiled by the infirmarian who passes through it even more often than you do, and you step into the green quiet of the garden, closing the gate behind you with a soft click of the latch. The largest bed, the one against the south wall where the heat gathers and radiates back from the stones, is planted with madder, a low, sprawling plant with small yellow flowers that appear in midsummer and long, trailing roots that burrow deep into the soil. The roots are the part you use, thick and reddish-orange inside, and when dried and ground, they yield a dye that makes a warm, rusty ink, the color of old iron or autumn bracken. You do not harvest the madder roots until the plants are at least 3 years old because the color deepens with age and you keep a careful record in your ledger of when each section of the bed was planted, marking the rows with small wooden stakes that have the year written on them in charcoal. The next bed over is planted with weld, a tall plant that grows straight up on a single stalk, its leaves narrow and pointed, and its flowers a cluster of tiny yellow-green blossoms at the top. Weld gives a clear, bright yellow ink, the color of spring butter or the center of a daisy, and the scribes use it for the small decorative capitals that begin each verse of the Psalter, a touch of light in the dense black text. You gather the flowering tops in midsummer when the color is strongest, cutting the stalks with a small curved knife and tying them in bundles to hang from the rafters of the library. The bundles swing gently in the draughts from the windows, and they fill the room with a faint, hay-like scent that mingles with the beeswax and the old vellum. Against the east wall, in the shadiest part of the garden where the sun only reaches for a few hours in the early morning, you grow woad, a plant that looks unremarkable at first glance, its leaves a dusty blue-green and its flowers a pale yellow that hardly show against the stems. But the leaves, when they are harvested and fermented and dried in a long, careful process that you only perform once every few years, produce a pale blue ink that the scribes use very sparingly, a rare and precious color that appears only in the most important manuscripts. A single blue initial on the first page of a gospel book, or a delicate blue line tracing the edge of an illuminated border. The woad bed is small, only a few plants, and you tend it with particular care, weeding around the base of each plant with your fingers, watering them with the copper can in dry weather, and checking the leaves for the small green caterpillars that sometimes appear and must be picked off one by one. The rest of the garden is given over to the herbs that protect the books rather than color them, large bushy plants of rosemary that grow waist-high and fill the air with their sharp, resinous scent whenever you brush against them. The rosemary keeps the moths away from the woolen bookmarks and the felt pads that cushion the chains on the lecterns, and you tuck small sprigs of it into the linen bags that guard the hidden cupboard and the shelves. There is lavender too, tall stems with purple-grey flowers that the bees visit in the summer, and you harvest the flower heads when they are fully open, drying them in small bunches and crumbling the dried buds into the bags, where their scent lasts for months. A patch of wormwood grows in the corner, its silvery leaves bitter and strong, and you make a weak tea from it that you brush onto the wooden shelves to discourage the small beetles that sometimes bore into the boards. The wormwood tea stains the wood a faint greenish-grey, but it fades in time and leaves behind only its sharp, clean smell and its protective properties. The work in the garden follows the turning of the year as closely as the liturgy follows the calendar of saints, each season bringing its own small set of tasks. In the spring, after the last frost has melted and the soil has warmed enough to crumble in your hand, you dig the beds with a wooden spade, turning the dark earth in long straight rows, breaking the clods with your hands and picking out the stones and the old roots. The soil is rich and dark from years of compost, a mixture of kitchen scraps and fallen leaves and the sweepings from the library floor, everything returning to the earth and becoming earth again. You spread a thin layer of this compost over the beds before you dig, working it into the soil with the spade, and the smell of it is earthy and sweet, the smell of slow, patient decay that feeds the new growth. The seeds are planted in shallow drills that you draw with a pointed stick, straight lines that run the length of the beds, and you drop the seeds in one by one, spacing them by eye, covering them with a fine layer of soil and pressing it down with your palm. The madder seeds are small and reddish, like tiny beads, and the weld seeds are so fine they are almost dust, a pinch scattered along the drill and then covered with a whisper of soil. You water the newly planted beds with a copper watering can that sheds a gentle, even rain from its rows, the water sparkling in the low spring light, and you repeat this watering each evening for a week or two, until the first green shoots appear, pushing up through the soil in tiny, determined points. The germination is always a quiet marvel to you, the way life emerges from those dry, dead-looking seeds, the way the green spreads across the dark soil until the beds are covered with a fuzz of new leaves. The summer months are for weeding and watering, for watching the plants grow taller and broader, for noting the way the woad leaves expand in broad rosettes, the way the madder stems sprawl across the soil and send up new shoots, the way the rosemary bushes become dense and woody and full of the small grey-green needles that contain their sharp, aromatic oil. You pull the weeds by hand, kneeling on a flat stone that you move from bed to bed, your fingers working around the base of the herbs to loosen the chickweed and the goosegrass and the other opportunistic plants that spring up wherever the soil is good. The weeds go into a bucket and then onto the compost pile, where they will break down and become next year's soil, a closed loop of growth and decay that you participate in without needing to understand its chemistry. The watering can is filled from the stone basin in the center of the garden, and you carry it back and forth along the paths, tipping it carefully so that the water falls directly onto the roots and not onto the leaves, where it might scorch in the midday sun. The sound of the water hitting the dry soil is a soft, musical patter, and the scent of wet earth rises around you, rich and dark. The harvesting comes in the late summer and early autumn, and each plant is gathered at its own particular moment of peak readiness. The well tops are cut when the flowers are fully open and the stalks have turned from green to a pale, straw-like yellow, and you bundle them with twine and carry them up to the library where you hang them from the rafters. The rosemary and lavender are cut just as the flowers begin to open, their oils at their strongest, and they fill the garden with their scent as you work, the fragrance clinging to your hands and your robe for the rest of the day. The madder roots are dug in the autumn of the plant's third year, the slow, careful excavation that requires you to loosen the soil deeply with a fork and then pull the roots out by hand, following their winding path through the earth. The roots are long and thin, like red-brown twine, and you wash them in the stone basin, the water turning a rusty orange as the outer skin loosens and floats away. They are spread on a rack in the sun to dry for several days, and then they are cut into small pieces with your knife and stored in a clay jar with a cork stopper, ready for the day when you will make the red ink. The making of ink from these plants is a slow alchemy that takes place in the library, on the work table near the brazier, a process that spans several days and fills the room with shifting fragrances. For the madder red, you take a handful of the dried root pieces and place them in a small iron pot with enough rainwater to cover them, then set the pot on a trivet over the coals to simmer. The water slowly takes on a deep, rusty hue, and you stir it with a hazel twig, watching the color deepen from pale orange to the shade of dried blood. When the liquid has reduced by half and reached the right intensity, you strain it through a linen cloth into a clean pot, squeezing the cloth to extract every drop of color, and you add a pinch of alum, a white crystalline powder that the monastery purchases from the same trader who brings the gum arabic. The alum brightens the color and fixes it to the page, and you stir it in with the twig until it dissolves completely, the liquid turning a shade brighter and clearer. The finished ink is poured into a small clay pot labelled with a slip of parchment, and added to the shelf where the other inks wait for the scribes. The yellow ink from Weld is made in much the same way. The dried flowering tops simmered in rainwater until the water turns a clear golden yellow, the colour of honey held up to the light. You add a little alum to this as well, and the yellow brightens, becoming almost luminous, a colour that seems to hold a piece of the summer sun that grew the plants. The blue from woad is a much more complicated process, one that you have only attempted twice in your years at the monastery, a fermentation that requires the leaves to be pulped and pressed into balls that are dried in the sun and then aged for months before they can be used. But the result is a blue so pale and delicate that it seems almost like a memory of the sky rather than the sky itself. The scribes treasure this blue ink, and they use it only for the most important words, the name of the Lord, the first letter of a gospel, the dedication page of a new psalter. When the ink making is done and the pots are lined up on the shelf, their labels facing outward in your small, careful script, you clean the work table and the iron pot and the straining cloths, carrying the wash water down to the garden to pour it onto the garden to pour it onto the compost pile. The circle is complete, the plants grown in the earth returning to the earth, the colours they yielded now sealed in clay pots and waiting for the moment when a scribe will dip a quill into them and draw a line of bright gold or rusty red across a page of clean vellum. You stand in the garden at the end of such a day, the sun low over the hills, the rosemary bushes casting long shadows across the gravel paths, and you feel a deep satisfaction in this small, quiet loop of growth and making, a loop that has turned here for centuries and will turn for centuries more, as steady and as patient as the seasons themselves. The monastery breathes at a different pace through the turning year, and your work in the library absorbs those changes as naturally as the vellum absorbs the humidity in the air, expanding and contracting, softening and stiffening, always responding to the world outside, even though the room itself remains sheltered and still. You come to know the seasons not by the liturgical calendar that hangs in the sacristy, though that calendar is always present in the background, but by the quality of the light that falls through the tall windows, the scent of the air that moves through the cracked shutters, the particular tasks that each phase of the year demands of your hands. The library is a room governed by its own internal clock, a clock that runs slower than the bell tower and marks time in the fading of ink, the cracking of leather, the slow drift of dust across the floorboards. Spring arrives at the monastery not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual loosening, a softening of the hard edges that winter has imposed. The first sign is always the light, a subtle shift in the angle of the sun that sends the morning beams a little farther across the floorboards, a little closer to the far wall, and you notice it one morning during your usual round when the patch of warm gold that falls on the third lectern has moved a hand's breadth to the left from where it was the week before. The air that comes through the cracked windows carries a different scent now, a damp, earthy freshness that speaks of melting frost and waking soil, and you open the shutters a little wider each day, letting the cross breeze move through the room in a slow, gentle current that ruffles the edges of the pages on the lecterns. The first warm days of spring are the time for the great airing, a task that you perform once each year with the same methodical care you bring to everything else. You choose a morning when the sun is bright and the breeze is steady from the west, and you open all the windows fully, pushing the wooden frames outward until they are flush against the stone embrasures. The fresh air pours into the library in a great soft wave, stirring the dust motes into spiraling clouds that dance in the shafts of sunlight, lifting the faint mustiness that has accumulated during the closed months of winter and replacing it with the clean scent of wet grass and apple blossoms from the orchard beyond the cloister wall. You walk the length of the room, feeling the cross breeze on your face, and you open the door to the scriptorium as well, so that the air can flow through both rooms in a continuous, cleansing stream. While the windows are open, you perform the spring inspection, a careful examination of every book in the collection for the first signs of the small creatures that also wake with the warmer weather. Silverfish are the main concern, tiny, quick insects that love the starch in the binding paste and the size in the vellum, and you check the gutters of each book with particular attention, looking for the faint silvery trails they leave behind, or the tiny irregular holes they chew in the pages. You find a few of these trails in the old gradual, thin, glistening lines that trace along the inner margin of the pages, and you set the book aside on the work table for treatment. The treatment is simple and gentle, a matter of placing small dishes of crushed bay leaves on the shelf where the book usually rests, the sharp aromatic oil of the leaves discouraging the insects without harming the parchment. You crush the bay leaves in your mortar, the same one you use for the oak galls, and the scent that rises is warm and spicy, a clean green fragrance that fills the corner of the library where the gradual lives. The silverfish do not like this scent, and they move on to other places, leaving the book in peace. Spring is also the time for the garden work that you have already done, the digging and the planting and the first watering of the new seeds, and you move between the library and the garden throughout these weeks, carrying the smell of fresh earth on your hands when you return to the books. The days grow longer, the light lingering in the windows until well past vespers, and you find yourself staying in the library later in the evenings, working by the soft grey glow of the dusk, rather than lighting the lamp, unwilling to close the shutters on the sweet, cool air and the sound of the blackbirds singing in the cloister garth. Summer arrives with a heavy, golden heat that settles over the valley like a thick blanket and stays there for weeks at a time. The library, situated under the roof with its tall windows facing the morning sun, grows warm by midday and hot by the afternoon, the air inside becoming still and close despite the open windows. You learn to adjust your rhythm to the season, rising even earlier than usual to complete the morning round before the sun has climbed high enough to turn the room into an oven. You are at the library stairs while the sky is still pale pink and the birds are just beginning their first tentative calls, and you work quickly but calmly through the cool hours, the windows open wide to catch the last of the night's chill, the brazier left unlit because the day will provide more than enough warmth on its own. By the time the bell rings for sext, the heat has begun to build in earnest. The stone walls radiating the warmth they have absorbed since dawn, the air in the library taking on a drowsy golden quality that makes the dust motes hang suspended and slow. You close the shutters at this hour, pulling them tight against the sun, and the room falls into a dim, warm twilight, the only light coming from the cracks around the frames and the faint glow of the coals you have left in the brazier from the morning. You retreat to your cell for the heavy afternoon hours, lying on your narrow bed with the window open a crack and the linen sheet pulled up to your chin, and you doze in and out of a light, floating sleep while the cicadas drone in the cypress trees outside the wall. The sound of the cicadas is a continuous buzzing thrum that rises and falls in slow waves, and it becomes the soundtrack of the summer afternoons, a sound so constant that you stop hearing it unless you deliberately listen. In the late afternoon, when the sun has moved round to the west and the heat has begun to ease, you return to the library and open the shutters again. The air that rushes in is still warm, but no longer oppressive, and a breeze often springs up at this hour, a light wind from the hills that carries the scent of dry grass and wild thyme. You work through the evening hours, mending bindings or preparing ink, or simply sitting at the work table with the ledger open, recording the day's observations in your small, careful hand. The light at this hour is a soft, golden orange that makes the leather bindings glow and turns the vellum pages to the color of honey, and you pause often to look out the window at the cloister garth, where the monks are walking their slow, silent circuits in the cool of the evening, their shadows long and thin on the grass. The summer nights are short and warm, and you sometimes climb the library stairs after compline to check on the books one last time before sleep. The room is dark and still, the windows open to the star-filled sky, the only light the faint glow of the moon on the floorboards. You walk the familiar path by memory and touch, your hand resting on the lecterns as you pass, and you pause at the hidden cupboard to place your palm on the floorboard above it, a silent good night to the books that rest below. The little owl in the bell tower calls through the open windows, and you stand there in the darkness, listening, feeling the warm night air on your face before you descend the stairs and make your way to your cell. Autumn comes to the monastery as a gradual cooling, the fierce heat of summer giving way to mild golden days and crisp, cold nights. The light changes again, the angle of the sun dropping lower, the beams that fall through the windows turning from gold to a paler, more silvery hue. The scent of the air shifts as well, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the kitchen fires, the tang of fallen leaves from the orchard, and a faint, dusty dryness that speaks of the earth preparing for its long sleep. The autumn is the season for checking the roof, a task that you perform with the help of the monastery's carpenter, a young brother with strong hands and a quiet manner who comes up the stairs with a ladder over his shoulder and a bucket of lime paste in his hand. The two of you work together on a clear, cool morning when the sky is a deep, cloudless blue and the wind is light from the north. The carpenter sets the ladder against the wall below the chimney, and you climb up after him, emerging through a small trapdoor onto the sloped lead roof that covers the library. The view from here is wide and beautiful, the whole valley spread out below, the fields a patchwork of brown and gold, the village a cluster of grey roofs and a thin spire of smoke, the hills beyond fading into a blue-grey haze. You do not linger on the view, however, because the task at hand requires attention, a careful inspection of the lead flashing around the chimney and the seams where the roof meets the stone walls. The carpenter runs his fingers along the lead, feeling for cracks or gaps, and you follow behind him with the bucket of lime paste, patching any small openings with a wooden spatula, smoothing the paste until it forms a watertight seal. The work is slow and methodical, the two of you moving around the chimney and along the ridgeline, and when it is done you climb back down through the trapdoor, carrying the empty bucket, satisfied that the library will stay dry through the winter rains and snows. The autumn is also the time for the final harvest in the herb garden, the digging of the madder roots and the cutting of the last lavender and rosemary before the frost. You carry the herbs up to the library in flat baskets, and you spend an afternoon tying them into bundles and hanging them from the rafters, the rosemary and lavender adding their scent to the air, the madder roots spread on a rack near the brazier to dry. The library takes on a new fragrance in the autumn, a mixture of dried herbs and wood smoke and old leather, a warm, earthy scent that feels like the room is preparing itself for the quiet months ahead. The autumn light is the most beautiful of the year, a clear, golden light that slants low through the windows and illuminates every scratch and grain in the wooden lecterns, every thread in the leather bindings, every speck of dust on the floorboards. You find yourself pausing often in your work to look at the way the light falls on a particular book, the way it catches the edge of a page and makes the vellum glow from within, and you feel a quiet gratitude for the simple beauty of the room, a beauty that asks nothing of you but your attention. Winter arrives with a silence that is deeper than any other season, a silence that seems to press down on the monastery from the low grey sky. The first snow falls in the night, and you wake to a world transformed, the cloister garth a smooth white blanket, the roofs covered in a thick layer of white that muffles every sound. The library is cold on these winter mornings, the brazier having died down to ash in the night, and you spend the first part of the morning building up the fire, adding fresh charcoal piece by piece until the coals glow, a steady, warm orange, and the room begins to thaw. You keep the brazier burning all day in the winter, feeding it at regular intervals, and the warmth it gives is a gentle, radiant heat that takes the chill from the air without making the room hot. The winter light is pale and thin, a soft grey-white glow that comes through the windows and casts no shadows, and the library feels smaller and more intimate in this light, a warm cocoon against the cold world outside. The snow piles up on the windowsills, blocking the lower panes, and the sound of the wind is a distant, muffled moan that never enters the room but remains outside, held at bay by the thick stone walls and the sturdy shutters. You work close to the brazier on these days, mending the same bindings again with cold-stiffened fingers, pausing to warm your hands over the coals before returning to the needle and thread. The work is slow in the winter, the cold making everything take a little longer, but you do not mind the slowness, because the winter is the quietest time, a time for patience and for the small repetitive tasks that can be done without hurry. The hidden books in their cupboard beneath the floor are safe and warm, insulated by the cedar lining and the layer of wool felt that you have placed between them and the boards. You check them as you always do, lifting the ring and peering inside, and you find them dry and sound, their pages full of summer light trapped in ink, their leather bindings supple and whole. The winter is the season when you feel the weight of your responsibility most keenly, not as a burden but as a comfort, a sense that you are doing something quiet and good by keeping these books safe through the cold and the dark. You imagine them waiting in their cupboard, patient and still, and you know that when the spring comes again and the light returns, they will be ready for another year of silent preservation, another turn of the great, slow wheel that carries the library and its keeper through the seasons without end. The light begins to change in the late afternoon, a subtle shift that you have learned to read as clearly as the position of the sun on a sundial. The golden quality of the midday fades into a softer amber tone, and the shadows that have been shrinking toward the walls all morning begin to stretch out again across the floorboards, lengthening slowly, reaching toward the eastern windows like dark water spreading across a flat shore. This is the hour when the library begins its slow transition from day to night, a transition that you guide with the same quiet, methodical care you bring to every other part of your work, a series of small, repeated actions that close the room down gently, layer by layer, until it rests in perfect stillness. You know the exact moment to begin the evening rituals without consulting any timepiece, because the light itself tells you, the way it softens and warms, the way the dust motes that have been dancing in the sunbeams all afternoon begin to slow their spiraling motion as the beams fade. You set down whatever task has been occupying your hands, the mending of a binding, or the trimming of a quill, or the recording of a note in the ledger, and you rise from the work table, stretching your arms once, feeling the pleasant ache in your shoulders from a day spent leaning over books. The brazier has burned low during the afternoon, the coals reducing to a bed of soft grey ash with a few remaining orange hearts glowing faintly underneath, and you walk to it first, because it is the warm heart of the room, and its extinguishing marks the true beginning of the close. The small iron lid that you use to cover the coals rests on a hook beside the brazier, and you lift it with a folded cloth to protect your fingers from the heat. You place the lid carefully over the coals, settling it into the rim of the brazier with a soft, metallic sound that echoes once in the quiet room. The glow of the coals disappears under the iron, and the thin plume of smoke that has been rising into the flue all day begins to thin and fade. You watch the last wisps of smoke curl upward and vanish, and the room feels different immediately, a degree cooler, a shade quieter, as if the library itself has let out a long, slow breath and begun to settle into its night posture. You will empty the ash in the morning, a task for the first round of the new day, but for now the brazier is at rest, a dark iron shape in the corner that will hold its warmth for another hour or two and then grow cold. From the brazier you move to the windows, walking along the eastern wall in the same order you follow every evening, a route that has become so familiar your feet find the way without any conscious direction from your mind. The first window is the one nearest the stairs, and you place your hands on the wooden frame, feeling the cool air that has begun to seep through the glass as the outside temperature drops. You pull the window shut with a gentle, steady motion, the frame sliding into the stone embrasure with a soft thud, and you lower the iron hook that latches it closed from the inside, a simple mechanism that has held the window secure for 300 years. The glass shivers slightly in its leading as the frame settles, and then it is still, a dark rectangle that reflects the faint light of the room rather than letting in the grey sky outside. You move to the second window, then the third, repeating the same motion each time, the pull of the frame, the settling of the glass, the lowering of the hook, a slow, rhythmic sequence that feels like a series of quiet good nights to the world beyond the walls. The shutters come next, the heavy wooden panels that are fitted inside the window frames and provide an extra layer of darkness and insulation against the night. You swing each pair of shutters closed from their folded position against the embrasure walls, the iron hinges turning silently because you oiled them in the autumn with a drop of linseed oil, a small act of maintenance that makes this nightly task smooth and easy. The shutters meet in the center of the window with a soft, hollow sound, and you fit the small iron bar across them, slotting it into the brackets that hold the shutters tight together. The room darkens perceptibly with each window you close, the ambient grey light from outside being shut away piece by piece until the library is lit only by the single oil lamp that burns on the work table, its flame a steady yellow point that casts long swaying shadows on the walls and ceiling. You pause at the last window, looking out through the glass before you close it, taking in the view that has been your companion all day. The cloister garth where the first lamps are being lit in the walkway, the well casting its deep shadow, the dark shapes of the cypress trees against the pale western sky. Then you pull this window shut too, and the view disappears, replaced by the dark reflection of the room and your own face, dim and indistinct in the wavery glass. The library is now fully enclosed, sealed against the coming night, and the air inside is still and warm, holding the last of the heat from the brazier and the faint mixed scent of old vellum, beeswax, wood smoke, and dried herbs. You walk to the work table and lift the oil lamp, carrying it with you as you begin the next part of the evening ritual, the final circuit of the lecterns. Each book must be closed, each clasp fastened, each chain arranged in its loose coil, a process that you perform with the same patient attention you give to the morning round, though the mood is different now, less a greeting and more a farewell, a gentle putting to bed of the volumes that have been opened and read and consulted through the day. The psalter on the first lectern is open to the psalms of the day, and you close it carefully, lifting the front cover and bringing it over to meet the back, the pages settling together with a soft papery sigh. The metal clasp, a small hook of brass set into the foredge, is fastened with a press of your thumb, the hook sliding into its catch with a tiny click that is satisfying in its finality, a small sound of completion. The chain that holds the psalter to the lectern is arranged in a loose figure eight beside the book, the links lying flat and untangled, ready for the first reader of the morning. The Gospel lectionary on the second lectern was left open by one of the brothers who consulted it earlier in the day, and you close this too, checking that the page marker, a thin strip of red-dyed vellum, is tucked into the correct place before you fasten the clasp. The gradual on the third lectern requires a little extra care. Its pages are large and heavy, and you support the spine with one hand while you close the cover with the other, making sure that no pages are caught or folded at the edges. You continue around the room, closing each book in turn, your lamp casting a warm circle of light that moves with you from lectern to lectern. The books on the low shelf receive their own attention, a check that their spines are aligned, that no volume has been left lying on its side, that the small linen bags of lavender between them are still in place. You run your finger along the row of spines, feeling the different textures of the leather, some smooth and polished by years of handling, others rough and grainy where the hide was left more natural. The books are cool to the touch, the leather having given up its warmth to the evening air, and they seem to be already sleeping, their pages closed, their words resting in the dark. The scriptorium door stands open, and you step inside with the lamp, checking that the scribes have left their desks in good order. They always do, the three older brothers being as careful in their habits as you are in yours, but you check anyway, a part of the ritual that cannot be skipped. The quills are standing upright in their pots of dry sand, the ink pots are sealed with cork stoppers, the sheets of parchment are laid flat under weighted boards to prevent curling, and the small knives for scraping mistakes are sheathed in leather guards and placed in the wooden tray where they live. The room is dark and quiet, the south window already shuttered by the last scribe to leave, and you nod to yourself and step back into the main library, closing the scriptorium door behind you with a soft click of the latch. The last and most important part of the evening circuit is the hidden cupboard beneath the floorboards near the third lectern. You carry the lamp to the spot and kneel down, setting the lamp on the floor beside you, and you find the seam of the board with your fingers, brush away the day's dust, and hook your finger through the iron ring. The board lifts silently on its oiled hinges, and the lamplight falls into the cedar-lined cavity, illuminating the stack of books with their dark leather spines, the small linen bags of lavender and rosemary tucked between them, the clean, dry wood that shows no sign of damp or insects. You place your hand on the cool leather of the topmost book, a gesture of simple farewell until morning, and you feel the familiar weight of the responsibility, light and warm, a trust that you carry without strain. The board is lowered back into place, pressed down until it sits flush with the surrounding floor, and you brush a new scattering of dust across the seam with your fingertips, a small concealment that is more habit than necessity now, a gesture that closes the day's care of the hidden texts. The library is now fully at rest, every book closed, every window sealed, every chain coiled, the brazier covered, the hidden books safe in their cedar darkness. You stand in the center of the room for a moment, holding the lamp, and you look around at the quiet space, the rows of lecterns like patient animals, sleeping in the dim light, the high ceiling lost in shadow, the faint scent of the room settling around you like a familiar blanket. The silence is deeper now than it is during the day, a thick, velvety silence that seems to have its own texture, its own gentle weight, and you breathe it in, letting it fill your lungs and slow your heart, a final moment of communion with the room before you leave it to the night. You pick up the lamp and walk to the spiral stairs, your footsteps the only sound, each one a soft, deliberate placement of your wooden clog on the worn oak boards. The stairs descend in their tight curve, the wall cool and smooth under your hand, and you emerge into the chapter house below, a dark round room with the stone benches empty around the walls, and the faint scent of incense drifting in from the church. The cloister walk is lit by a single oil lamp hanging from a hook near the refectory door, and you follow its glow along the familiar path, the arches repeating in the darkness on either side, the garth a deep well of shadow where the grass is invisible, and only the well capstone catches a faint gleam from the lamp. The air outside is cool and clean, carrying the smell of damp stone and the faint, sweet scent of night-blooming flowers from the infirmary garden, and you walk slowly, in no hurry to end this quiet, liminal time between the closing of the library and the last office of the day. The church is lit by a single candle on the high altar, its flames steady and small, casting a soft gold circle that illuminates the carved wooden reredos and the plain stone walls. The brothers are already gathering for compline, their brown robes blending into the shadows as they take their places in the choir stalls, their hands tucked into their sleeves, their heads bowed. You find a place in the back row, a stall that has become yours over the months, its wood worn smooth by the brother who sat there before you, and you settle into it, feeling the hard, familiar surface under you, the slight curve of the back that supports your spine. The chanting begins, the same words that have been sung at this hour for centuries, and the voices of the brothers rise and fall in the slow melodic rhythm that you have come to know so well, a rhythm that asks nothing of your mind but receives everything of your attention. You let the words wash over you without holding on to them, a river of sound that flows through the dark church and carries with it all the small cares of the day, the dust that settled on the third lectern, the cracked binding that needs mending, the madder roots that are drying on the rack, the quiet good night you said to the hidden books. All of it floats away on the chant, and you are left empty and peaceful, a vessel filled only with the sound and the candlelight and the cool, still air. After the final blessing, the brothers file out of the church in silence, their sandals brushing the stone floor, and you walk with them as far as the cloister, where you turn toward your cell, and they turn toward the dormitory. The little owl in the bell tower calls as you cross the open space, a soft repeated note that you answer silently in your mind, a small recognition of a fellow creature who keeps the night watch. Your cell is dark when you enter, the window showing only the faint grey of the moonless sky, and you set the lamp on the ledge, its light flickering once before steadying. You wash your face in the basin, the water cold and clean, and you dry it on the rough linen towel. Your wool tunic is hung on the peg by the door, your clogs lined up under the bed, your knife and comb placed side by side on the table. You lie down on the narrow bed, pulling the grey wool blanket up to your chin, and you leave the window open a crack so that the cool night air can move across your face. The monastery settles around you, the tiny creaks of timber and stone, the distant murmur of a brother turning in his sleep, the soft rush of the wind through the cloister arches. The last image in your mind before sleep takes you is the library above the chapter house, dark and still, the books standing in their silent rows, the hidden cupboard secure beneath its dusted seam, the room waiting patiently for the morning when you will climb the stairs again and open the windows to the new light, beginning the cycle once more. The thought is a peaceful one, and you carry it with you as your breathing slows and deepens, the boundary between waking and sleep blurring and then dissolving, until there is only the quiet, the dark, and the slow, steady rhythm of the monastery breathing around you in the night. The years in the library pass without hurry, settling one on top of another like the thin layers of dust that gather on the windowsills between your weekly cleanings, each one indistinguishable from the last, each one adding an almost imperceptible depth to the patina of your daily life. You do not mark the anniversaries of your arrival with any particular ceremony, because the monastery itself does not mark them, the community's sense of time being governed by the great wheel of the liturgical year, rather than the personal milestones of its members. But you notice the small changes in yourself, the way your hands have learned the exact weight of each book without conscious thought, the way your feet find the creaking floorboards and avoid them in the dark, the way the smell of old vellum and beeswax has become so familiar that you no longer notice it unless you leave the library for more than a day. Your body has settled into the rhythms of the place as deeply as your mind has. The early rising no longer a discipline, but a simple fact. The late evenings no longer a tiredness, but a gentle unwinding. The hair at your temples has begun to show threads of grey, and the joints of your fingers have developed a slight stiffness in the cold months that you ease by warming them over the brazier before you begin the morning sewing. The abbot who first welcomed you to the monastery and entrusted you with the hidden books has grown older too, his face more deeply lined, his walk slower, his voice softer, though his eyes retain the same calm, patient quality they had on that first evening in the garden. You still sit with him sometimes on the stone bench at the end of the vegetable beds, watching the mist rise in the autumn dusk, and you still speak very little, the silence between you being a comfortable presence rather than an absence. The library itself has changed hardly at all, which is the nature of a well-kept room, a space maintained in a state of quiet equilibrium, where the forces of decay and the forces of care balance each other perfectly. The books on the lecterns are the same books, their bindings a little older, but no weaker, their pages still legible, their chains still smooth and strong. The hidden cupboard beneath the floorboards is still dry and secure, the cedar lining still fragrant, the linen bags of lavender and rosemary still replaced each season, the books inside still resting in their patient darkness. You have read each of the hidden texts many times now, not cover to cover but in small pieces, a page here, a diagram there, a poem on a grey winter afternoon when the snow was falling outside and the library was warm and still. The geometry text has taught you the elegance of pure reason, the way a circle divided by a line creates a relationship that is both inevitable and beautiful. The star treatise has given you a sense of the vast, slow dance of the heavens, a perspective that makes the library feel both tiny and infinitely precious. The medical compendium has taught you the names of plants you've never seen, but can describe in detail a garden of the mind that grows alongside the physical garden behind the infirmary. The poems have given you a way of seeing the natural world that is both sharper and softer, a way of noticing the exact shade of green in a new leaf or the precise pattern of rain on the cloister roof. The scribes in the scriptorium have continued their work through all these years, though the faces have changed. Brother Anselm, the oldest of the three, finished his last psalter and then did not return to the scriptorium the following winter, his fingers having become too stiff to hold the quill. He spent his final years in the infirmary, where you visited him sometimes, bringing him small sprigs of rosemary from the garden to hold and smell, the sharp scent reminding him of the scriptorium where he had worked for so many decades. 2 younger brothers have taken the places of those who have gone, trained by the remaining senior scribe, and they have learned the same careful, unhurried techniques, the same way of holding the quill, the same way of mixing the ink, the same way of drawing the square neumes that march across the pages of the graduals. You prepare their materials as you always have, the oak gall ink, the trimmed quills, the sheets of vellum inspected for flaws, and you watch them work with the same quiet satisfaction, knowing that the chain of knowledge is unbroken. The day comes, as it must, when the abbot asks you to train a younger brother to assist you in the library. This brother, a quiet man named Brother Martin, who came to the monastery from a village in the north, has a gift for careful stitching and a love of vellum that you recognize the first time he visited the library to consult the medical treatise. He stood at the lectern for a long time, turning the pages with a gentleness that spoke of an instinctive understanding of the material, and when he closed the book, he ran his hand over the leather binding with a gesture that was almost a caress. You saw this and knew that he was the one, and you mentioned his name to the abbot the next time you walked together in the garden. Brother Martin begins his apprenticeship on a mild spring morning when the windows are open and the air is full of the scent of apple blossoms. You show him the morning round first, the opening of the windows, the lighting of the brazier, the slow circuit of the lecterns. He follows you with his hands tucked into his sleeves, his eyes taking in everything, and he asks no questions because the work speaks for itself, each action explaining its own purpose. You show him the dusting, the way to brush the tops of the books without disturbing the pages, the way to sweep the floor with the birch twig broom, the way to check the chains for rough spots and the clasps for looseness. He learns by watching and then by doing, his hands moving with the same slow, deliberate care you have cultivated over the years, and you see in him a younger version of yourself, the same absorption in the task, the same quiet love for the books. The binding work takes longer to teach because it is a craft that lives in the fingers and can only be learned through repetition. You show Brother Martin how to remove a damaged binding without harming the pages, how to sort the gatherings by their signatures, how to set up the sewing frame and wax the thread and loop it around the cords. His first attempts are careful but a little stiff, the stitches not quite even, the tension not quite right, and you gently take the needle from his hand and show him again, your fingers demonstrating the exact pressure needed, the exact angle of the needle, the exact rhythm of the sewing. He practices on a damaged book that you have set aside for this purpose, a volume of sermons that has been read so many times its binding has worn through in 3 places, and over the course of several weeks his stitches grow more even, his tension more consistent, until he can sew a gathering as smoothly as you can. The garden work he takes to immediately, having grown up in a village where everyone tended a plot of vegetables and herbs. He knows the feel of good soil and the right amount of water to give young plants, and he takes over the watering of the herb beds with a natural ease that frees you to spend more time on the ink making and the binding repairs. The two of you work side by side in the garden on warm summer evenings, pulling weeds and harvesting lavender, and the silence between you is comfortable, the silence of two people who share a rhythm and do not need to fill it with words. The hidden cupboard is the last thing you show him, waiting until a quiet evening in his second month of training when the library is closed and the other brothers are at vespers. You lead him to the spot near the third lectern, and you kneel down, gesturing for him to kneel beside you. You show him the seam of the floorboard, the iron ring, the way to lift the board on its silent hinges, and the cedar-lined cavity beneath. You lift out the books one by one and place them in his hands, the geometry text, the star treatise, the medical compendium, the slim volume of poems, and you tell him what the abbot told you on that misty evening in the garden many years ago, that these books are not forbidden but hidden, that they need a guardian, that the trust is now passing to him. Brother Martin listens without speaking, his face grave and calm in the lamplight, and when you have finished, he nods once, a simple gesture that tells you he understands the weight of what he is receiving and accepts it without hesitation. The day you pass the responsibility fully to Brother Martin arrives without fanfare, a quiet morning in late autumn when the light is pale gold and the leaves are falling in the cloister garth. You have been preparing for this day for many months, gradually shifting your duties to him while you remain as a presence in the background, a resource to be consulted, a pair of hands that can still help with the heavy work. But the time has come when your body asks for more rest than the full round of duties allows, and you have made your peace with this, understanding that the passing of the roll is as natural as the turning of the seasons, part of the same quiet rhythm that governs everything in the monastery. You walk with Brother Martin through the morning round one last time, watching him open the windows and light the brazier and make the slow circuit of the lecterns, and you see that he does it exactly as you taught him. with the same patience, the same attention, the same quiet love for the books. You hand him the ledger, the small bound notebook with its pages filled with your careful entries, and you place your hand briefly on his shoulder before turning to leave the library. You walk down the spiral stairs for the last time as the keeper of the books, your hand on the cool stone wall, your footsteps slow and steady, and you emerge into the chapter house, and then into the cloister walk. The day is bright and cool, the sky a clear pale blue, the cypress trees dark against the stone walls, and you walk across the garth to the stone bench at the end of the vegetable garden, the same bench where the abbot first told you about the hidden books. You sit down, feeling the sun warm on your neck and the back of your hands, and you listen to the familiar sounds of the monastery, the distant chant from the church, the soft scratch of a quill from the scriptorium window above, the chink of the kitchen brother's ladle against the iron pot, the call of the little owl settling into its roost in the bell tower. The sounds are the same sounds you have heard every day for so many years that they have become a part of you, woven into the fabric of your being, and you know that they will continue long after you are gone, the same unchanging rhythm, carrying the community forward through the centuries. You think about the library above the chapter house, the books standing in their silent rows, the hidden cupboard secure beneath its dusted seam, the new keeper walking his own morning round with the same steady, patient pace. You think about the books that have passed through your hands, the worn leather, the soft vellum, the dark ink, the words that have been read and copied and preserved by generations of unknown hands. You think about the quiet, gentle work of protecting a few pages of ancient thought, a work without drama or climax, a work that asks nothing but your presence and your steady breathing, day after day, season after season, like the turning of a page that never ends. The monastery endures, the library endures, and you have been a small part of that endurance, a single link in a chain that stretches back into the past and forward into the future, a chain made of ink and vellum and leather and the patient, invisible labor of care. The sun moves slowly across the garden, the shadows of the cypress trees lengthening on the grass, and you remain on the stone bench, feeling the peace of the place settle into your bones. The peace is not an absence of activity, but a fullness of rhythm, a sense that everything is exactly as it should be, that the books are safe, that the new keeper is learning and growing into his role, that the work will continue without interruption. You realize that the deepest peace you have ever known is this: the stillness of a room full of books, the soft weight of dust that settles and is brushed away and settles again, the endless patient cycle of care that asks nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, nothing more than a steady hand and a quiet heart. You close your eyes and let the sun warm your face, and you breathe in the scent of rosemary and lavender and old stone, and you know that when the bell rings for the next office, you will rise and go to your place in the choir stall, and after that you will return to the library not as its keeper, but as its friend, a quiet presence in the corner, a pair of hands that can still mend a binding or trim a quill, or simply sit and watch the light move across the floor, a keeper emeritus whose word